Friday, 30th of September 1938. The image of the woman Telford had just killed wouldn't leave him. He was almost sure she deserved to die, and if he hadn't drowned her first, he was fatally certain that he himself would now be dead. Those are the opening lines to the second of my novels about the Spanish Civil War, this one, Until the Curtain Falls. And my name's Dave McCall. I write historical fiction under the pen name David Ebsworth, and this is the third of three podcasts about the background to my Spanish Civil War novels. We've already talked about some of Franco's battlefield tourism and the way that he used that and other propaganda tools to try and win the propaganda battle during the conflict. And then we talked about the Siege of Madrid as part of the background to the books, and how Jack Telford, the hero of the stories, manages to become involved in those aspects of the conflict. Today, I'm going to finish off with this third podcast by just talking a little bit about the end of the Spanish Civil War and what happened to some of the main characters that we've talked about so far. I've mentioned the International Brigades a few times, and you'll remember that there were 35,000 volunteers from 53 different countries, the largest single contingent of Polish volunteers who went out to fight in Spain, about 3,000 people from the USA and Canada, and about 2,500 from Britain and Ireland who went out to fight there. I should have said, of course, that there were also volunteers that went out to fight for Franco and the generals on the fascist side, but these were much smaller in number. There were around about 1,000. Again, also many of those devout Catholics from Ireland and England and other places who went out convinced by Franco's propaganda that this was somehow a crusade, a godly crusade against the Russian Reds and so on and so forth, convinced by that propaganda. But they were, as I say, relatively small in number. And all of the volunteers who went out to fight on behalf of the democratically elected Republican government, the Popular Front government, almost all of those ended up in Albacete. And Albacete is a city, town, that's roughly halfway between Madrid and Alicante, and it's a very, very interesting place. The various international brigades were stationed there at different times, trained and then sent off to the front, and there are still many memorials to the international brigades there in Albacete, and many quite remarkable remembrances of the Spanish Civil War. There is a sort of a regional government office there with a set of railings outside, and they very deliberately kept the railings as they were in 1936 to 1939, pockmarked by shrapnel from the bombs that fell on Albacete during the war itself. And really, I suppose this is a good excuse for me to give a plug to those organisations that keep alive the memory of those volunteers who went out to fight in Spain. From a British and Irish point of view, most notably the International Brigade Memorial Trust that still functions. Many of the people involved are family members of those who went out to fight. Many of them are simply people who share the values of those volunteers, strong belief in democracy. And the IBMT is an organisation that's well worth supporting. The affiliation to it is relatively small. If you're interested in the Spanish Civil War at all, then I really would encourage you to join one of these organisations. So in Britain and Ireland, you can look these up easily. You can Google International Brigade Memorial Trust. If you're in the United States or Canada, then you can look up the organisation that's called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, ALBA. And again, you can affiliate to those organisations. There's a similar organisation in France, the ACER, and in Spain itself, for anybody living in Spain and again interested in any of this, the organisation that's basically an association of Friends of the International Brigade, the AABI, and all of these can be looked up. And as I said, I would really encourage folk to join those. So let's talk about Alicante for a minute. By the beginning of 1939, things are obviously looking grim for the Republic. More and more of Republican territory has been captured by Franco and the fascists. Catalonia very quickly comes under siege after the failure of the Ebro campaign. And all of slowly, all of Catalonia, right the way through Barcelona, right the way up to the French border, is taken by the nationalists. Before that, many tens of thousands of refugees had tried to flee from Spain, to flee from Franco and the fascists by escaping over the French border. Further south, the remaining territory was really the southern part of the Valencia region, and actually the Alicante province. And by early February, really, that was the only territory that was left to the Republic to hold. And the president of the Republic, Juan Negrín, had a plan that he would evacuate. So basically, they would move the capital. It had previously moved around all over the country, in Catalonia and other places. But he decided to move to Alicante province, and there to try and set up a last defence of the Republic. And they moved to a small location just outside Petrer, that's west of Alicante, a place called El Poblet. It's still there, and anybody driving along the highway between Alicante and Madrid passes within a few hundred yards of it, but you wouldn't know it. It's pretty derelict. It's been largely abandoned. But the nice thing is that with the 80th anniversary of the end of the Civil War coming up next year in 2019, it's now been agreed that El Poblet, that estate set of houses at El Poblet, will actually become something of a national monument and a museum to the last days of the Republic, and that's very, very welcome indeed. But of course, that all made Alicante a real target. It had been bombed many times already. And most famously, there was an attack on the market, the central market in Alicante, in which literally hundreds of people were killed. The Italians, as the Germans had done at Guernica, deliberately chose a busy market day to attack the central market there and inflicted huge casualties. But it was one of around about 70 plus bombing raids that took place in Alicante. And Alicante, for those who don't know the city itself, lots of people kind of arrive at Alicante airport and then shoot off north or south to the beaches. But for those who've spent time in what's a very lovely city, Alicante, a beautiful place, then you'll know that the Civil War there and the city's part in this, as the last capital of the Spanish Republic, is well commemorated. There are tours of the air raid shelters, and different sections of museums have various displays on to explain the city's part in this. What most people don't understand is that Alicante had a particular significance for us, the British, in this part of the conflict. Let me just go back a little bit and explain that the British government had a really clever plan. At the beginning of the war, we had the embassy in Madrid and we had consulates in different places. The British government's plan was that because we were supposed to be neutral, we would have workers paint huge Union Jacks on the tops of each of our embassies and consulate buildings all the way across Spain. Pretty obvious that it's a British building and therefore it's neutral. But of course, the testimony from Italian and German pilots after the war said that they were amazed. They'd fly over these towns and cities and they'd see these buildings with huge crosshairs painted on the tops of them, and they were just ideal targets. And it's literally for that reason that every single one of our embassies and consulates in Spain were bombed. And in Alicante, this was particularly sad because a bomb literally went through the centre of the Union Jack at our consulate in Alicante and killed the British consul there. We made not a single complaint about that. We made no objection. We didn't raise any fuss about it. And it fits in with the story that I told last time about Britain's establishment and the very strange role that we played during the Spanish Civil War, almost helping the airlift of the Army of Africa from Morocco into mainland Spain and a whole range of other things. The fact that it was a British pilot, Cecil Bebb, that helped Franco leave the Canary Islands and reunify himself with the Army of Africa, obviously with the knowledge of the British intelligence services and so on. So in Alicante, we had this tragedy, the British consuls killed there, and we didn't do anything about that. More sadly, I suppose, is that during the course of the war, something like 27 British merchant vessels were attacked in the Mediterranean by Italian U-boats, and we didn't do anything about that either. And actually, 12 of those vessels were sunk, and many crew members lost their lives in the course of those attacks. We didn't do anything about it at all. It's a very sad part of our history, I suppose. But thankfully, people in Spain don't really hold that against us. They appreciate the role that the British battalion and the international brigades in general played during the conflict. And they particularly remember a man called Archibald Dixon. And I said earlier on that in a strange way, the Spanish Civil War begins and ends with a Welshman. It begins with that ignominious affair of Cecil Bebb flying Franco from the Canary Islands to Morocco, but it ends with Archibald Dixon, almost literally the last couple of hours of the war. By this time, all of the refugees in Spain who were trying to escape from Franco and the nationalists are being funneled down into the Alicante area and towards Alicante city itself. Tens and tens of thousands of refugees. And they're going there because they've been promised that there'll be ships to take them off, to take them into exile, to take them to safety. But there are no ships. And on the day in question, on the 29th of March 1939, there's only one vessel in Alicante harbour, and it's a ship called the Stanbrook. Skipper, Cardiff skipper, Archibald Dixon. And Dixon's under strict instructions that he is not to take off any refugees. There's a cargo there waiting for him, a cargo of Valencia oranges, saffron, tobacco. And they're in the process of loading this when these refugees start pouring onto the quayside, begging for help. And Dixon does his best to comply with the instructions he's had from the ship owners. But by about 10:30 that night, really he can't stand it anymore, and he orders the oranges, the saffron, the tobacco to be thrown back onto the quayside, and he agrees to take on board 100 refugees. Now, the Stanbrook is a very, very small coastal trading vessel. She has a crew of 12 only, so she's a very, very small vessel. He puts 100 refugees on board, and they're still pouring onto the quayside. He puts another 100 on and another 100. And in the end, he's put a total of 1,835 refugees onto this tiny ship, crammed all of them onto the decks. And he's now got a problem because Alicante is surrounded by Italian U-boats with strict instructions to sink anything that comes out of Alicante harbour. But at midnight, Dixon decides that he'll douse every single navigation light on the vessel, and he weaves out of Alicante harbour between the U-boats, and he manages to successfully escape and take those 1,835 refugees to Oran in northern Africa. There's a sad postscript to this story because later on in the year, November, the war has escalated. It's become the Second World War as we now know it. And Archibald Dixon, with exactly the same crew on board the Stanbrook, are sailing across the North Sea, and they're attacked by a German U-boat, and they're sunk, and all hands are lost, including, of course, their skipper Archibald Dixon. But Dixon is remembered in Alicante. In Alicante Harbour, if you get a chance to go there, there's a very fine plaque with details of the Stanbrook on it and a bust of Archibald Dixon himself. And the city boasts at least one street that's called Calle Buque Stanbrook, the SS Stanbrook street. So very, very well known there. And it's almost a kind of a fitting end, really, to the story. But of course, it's not quite the end of the story. And that's pretty much where Until the Curtain Falls, my second novel, finishes off. But it isn't where the story ends, and it's certainly not where Jack Telford's story ends. There are, for anybody who's interested, there is already a published short story about Jack and his role during the Berlin airlift. And then there's also a novella that follows Jack Telford's story. It's called The Lisbon Labyrinth, and it sees Jack coming up towards retirement in 1974 and his involvement in the Portuguese Revolution. But there will be a third episode in Jack's involvement in the Spanish Civil War as well, because it follows the tale of the aftermath, really. What happened next? I've said already that Archibald Dixon took 1,835 refugees from Alicante and landed them in Oran. They weren't treated terribly well in Oran, and there in Oran there were another 500-600 refugees already arrived from other vessels. And over the course of the next couple of years, the people who were there who had been part of the Republican Army, many of the people on the Stanbrook were soldiers escaping from Franco. They know very well what's going to happen to them, by the way. And of course, after the war, in those kind of final closing days of the conflict itself, and for the next few years afterwards, reprisals against Republicans were awful. Paul Preston's book, The Spanish Holocaust, deals with this in a lot of detail, and it's now likely that something like 100,000 Spaniards were killed in extrajudicial executions by Franco in the course of those next few years. Brutal repression of anybody who'd fought on the Republican side, or indeed anybody who'd voted for the Republic and voted for the Popular Front, anybody who was socialist, a trade unionist, and so on. So people knew very well what was going to happen to them. And lots of those soldiers who escaped from Alicante with Archibald Dixon's help would doubtless have died, would have been executed, they'd have been shot by Franco. They end up in North Africa. The war begins. Most of them have been given a choice of either joining the French Foreign Legion or working on the Trans-Sahara Railroad. Many of them joined the French Foreign Legion, and over that troubled next couple of years, during which France falls, France itself is kind of divided down the middle, but eventually General de Gaulle, other French generals, form the Free French army to fight on the Allies' side, and huge numbers of those former Spanish Republican troops end up joining de Gaulle's Free French army, and they end up in Normandy. They fight in many places. They have a very distinguished record, and a group of them form a part of General Leclerc's army. They form an armoured division that's the 9th Division. They're still known as La Nueve, the 9th Division. And at the time that that Paris is due to be liberated, General de Gaulle is very keen. There's a big argument amongst the Allied generals about who should be the first troops to march into Paris, first troops down the Champs-Élysées, and of course it has to be French troops. But Leclerc insisted that they should go one better than that, and that the first troops actually down the Champs-Élysées, French troops, because they're fighting in the French army, actually should be this particular division, La Nueve. And therefore, the first troops down the Champs-Élysées in their armoured cars and their tanks are the 9th Division. And their tanks are emblazoned with the names of all of the battles that they fought in Spain, of Brunete and Belchite and Badajoz, Teruel, and so on and so forth. All of these names are emblazoned on their tanks. And these are the soldiers who really fight the war through to its bitter end, not in 1939 with the fall of Madrid, but literally with the demise of Hitler and Mussolini in 1944 and 1945. And many of them are still around to see the fall of Franco, the death of Franco in the mid-1970s, and the return of democracy. And that really is the end of their story, I suppose. And it's a happier one, really, than the story of the fall of Madrid and the fall of the Republic in 1939. Well, that just about brings me to the end, I suppose. I've said already, you can find my books and you can find references to the short stories and the novellas on my website. That's www.davidebsworth.com. And if anybody wants to email me direct, that's perfectly fine too. I'm always happy to chat about these things. And my email address is Dave McCall. It's MCCALL. So Dave McCall, all one word, at davidebsworth.org. So my website is davidebsworth.com and my email address is davidebsworth.org. Well, there you are. There must be 1,001 things that I haven't touched on that you might have been interested in. So please, if you want any more information, let me know. But overall, I hope you've enjoyed these podcasts and I hope you enjoyed the books. Thanks for listening.